All right, hello everybody. According to GPS time, it is 3 o'clock Eastern time, and we want to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming to our session about many happy returns. We're going to be focusing on patient engagement and what does that mean. During this session, we are going to have a couple of really quick presentations, but then really the meat of the session will be with our panelists. We'll be doing some discussion about some other players in the neuromodulation medical device world that have been involved in patient engagement and what that means for them. So again, if you want to ask questions, please do so in the chat box. Also, if you would like access to our slides, please privately chat your email address and we will be able to send that out to you at the end. So to kick off our session, I'd like to introduce Susan Schaeffer. Susan is the Executive Director of the Patient Academy, and she will kick off our session. Susan?
Thanks, Jen. Let me just get my slides here. So Jen, thank you for the introduction, and thank you to all of our panelists and participants for joining us today. We're really passionate about the topic of engaging patients and end users in the development of medical products. And what we thought we'd do today is begin with some lessons from industry and with a particular focus on what we're learning about how engaging with patients and end users can improve clinical execution and economics. And to date, there's a lot more data on the effects of patient engagement from the drug development world. And although the timelines and the economics in the pharma world are really different than they are in medical devices, still some of the drivers of clinical success and economic success are similar, and the benefits of engaging with patients and end users during the process are similar. So even though I'll be sharing some examples that do come from pharma, the specifics of these cases aren't what's important. It's understanding the underlying drivers and how they can apply to neuromodulation. Bear with me, there's a bit of a lag. There we go. So I'll start just briefly with a little bit about the Patients Academy for Research Advocacy. We are a nonprofit founded in the middle of 2018 with the purpose of filling a gap on the patient side that limits participation in R&D of medical products. What's happening is that almost across the board, the demand for input from patients, care partners, and end users in the development process is outstripping the capacity of patients to participate. And what's happening is that even as international regulators and companies developing both drugs and medical devices have become more and more aware of the benefits of engaging with the individuals who will use the products they develop, general awareness among the patient and consumer community remains very low. And among patients and consumers who are aware that there is an opportunity to participate in this process, many of them feel unqualified to weigh in on R&D. It's very foreign, it's intimidating, it can be extremely overwhelming, particularly for an individual who's managing their own or someone else's ongoing health condition. And so we see many individuals who could be really strong advocates who have lived experience that could be valuable in the process sitting on the sidelines. And so what we're doing at the Patients Academy is developing education and training that empowers patients to use their health experience to improve the R&D process. And turning back to the topic at hand and looking at the experience of drug developers, they really need that expertise. And here's why. 1 out of every 9 out of every 10 drugs that enter the clinic fail. They do not make it to market. And these failure rates are most extreme in the transition between phase 2 and phase 3, meaning after a significant amount of money has already been invested. And it's these high failure rates that drive pharma's astronomical R&D spend per approved drug. And you can see that by comparing the total of the out-of-pocket costs per phase, shown in the green boxes under the chart here, with the 1.4 billion average R&D spend per approved drug in the yellow box underneath the chart. And the thing is that a lot of these failures could be prevented with insight and input from patients. And why do I say that? Well, when we look at the most common reasons for failure, by far, poor enrollment in clinical studies is the biggest drug killer. We have data on all clinical trials from phase 1 through phase 4, so including post-market studies on the left. And more than half of the reasons for discontinuation are caused by low accrual. Even by the time we get to phase 3, where we have some more insight and more experience in the clinic, low accrual is still the biggest reason for failure. And the reasons for poor enrollment often boil down to products or trials that don't work for patients. For example, we may have inclusion or exclusion criteria that mean sites can't find enough patients who qualify. Maybe the product, if we haven't talked to patients or consumers, doesn't address the problems that are most important, or maybe the study isn't measuring the things that are most important. Maybe we are measuring what's important, but the benefit isn't big enough to make the risks acceptable to the end users. Or maybe the study requires too much travel, too many clinic visits, too many tests, or any number of other burdens that just make it way too difficult for a patient or a care partner to enter or remain on study. Now, many of these issues can certainly be addressed by amending the protocol once a study is underway, and that's a very common occurrence, particularly in drug development. But as you can see here, it still doesn't work much of the time. We still have a large proportion of products failing because the accrual problem can't be solved. A much better way to address these issues before a study ever begins is to engage with patients or end users. So here's one example concerning a phase 2 candidate that Pfizer was developing for Parkinson's disease. And it happens to be one of the examples where there's been more published and presented about than many of the examples of successful collaborations between patient advocates and medical product developers. The first attempt at getting this candidate through phase 2, which is represented by the left half of this figure, didn't go so well. And it wasn't because the product didn't work. It was because the study was too burdensome for patients to participate in. Because of the high burden, enrollment, the enrollment rate was only 1/3 of the historical enrollment rate for Parkinson's trials. And this study couldn't be saved. It ultimately had to be redone. So for the second attempt, which is represented by the right half of the figure, Pfizer decided to partner with Parkinson's Foundation. And Parkinson's Foundation led a protocol review with a group of patient advocates, which led to feedback that resulted in 3 major changes to Pfizer's proposed protocol. They selected different and fewer secondary endpoints related to non-motor symptoms. They changed the descriptions of the symptoms to be consistent with language that patients use to describe the symptoms. And they also developed or helped develop with Pfizer a new patient-reported outcome instrument, or PRO, that measured outcomes that were important to patients and their care partners, that weren't included in existing PROs. And also this PRO was easier for patients to complete because they adjusted parameters like the period of time which patients had to remember their symptoms to report them. And with these changes, the second time around, this study enrolled at twice the historical rate of Parkinson's studies. So they went from 1/3 of the rate of enrollment compared with historical trials to 2x the rate of enrollment. And that was all by considering and internalizing and acting on advice from patients about how to make the study more feasible to participate in. The benefits, of course, of engaging with patients can run across the product development cycle. If we start on the left of this figure with early research, patients can help prioritize where investments are made by communicating where the burden really is with respect to living with their condition and managing their condition, and also the burden of treatments for their condition if there are treatments available. Yesterday, Tracy Wheeler presented on how the Nielsen Foundation engaged with stakeholders to identify unmet needs where there was very little research, which translated into a call for proposals and actually stimulated research in the areas that spinal cord injury consumers identified as important. As we talked about with the Pfizer example, there are numerous benefits during the clinical phase of development that patient input can provide. In addition to improving enrollment rates, making studies more feasible can reduce protocol amendments and reduce dropout rates and improve adherence to protocol. And all of those things not only can save time in the development period, but also can improve the quality of data because you're not accounting for missing data from as many dropouts and protocol deviations. Patient input can also inform regulator assessments of benefit and risks, which are often at odds with patient preferences with respect to benefit and risk. And all of this, looking at the continuum across the development cycle, can speed up the delivery of new therapies to patients, which benefits them as the end users, but also has business benefits that can be measured. Now, there's a group out of Tufts, joined by some R&D executives from J&J, who published an approach to how to quantify the benefits of patient engagement in therapeutic and regulatory innovation in 2017. And again, the point here is more about the approach than it is about the specific data, because this is looking at a typical oncology development program, which, as we know, has very high R&D costs and also typically very high product revenues. But what they did is they used an expected net present value model, or ENPV, which reflects the risk-adjusted NPV, as a tool to compare scenarios with or without engagement. And the base case here in the first column is a representative oncology drug development program that uses average data on costs, timeline, and risks from the Tufts Center for Drug Development. And this base case assumes no engagement with patients. When we move to the second column, though, the model assumes that engaging with patients prior to the start of phase 2 avoids one protocol amendment. And this scenario is well supported with empirical data. For instance, we know that about 2/3 of phase 2 trials have at least one amendment. And we know that the #1 reason for amending protocols is difficulty with recruitment. A typical amendment adds out-of-pocket costs of about $500,000, and it also causes delays of about 90 days on average. So in this scenario, the gain that we see in expected net present value of $4 million, it's actually driven more by avoiding that 90-day delay than it is by avoiding the $500,000 in costs to amend. In the next column, we're describing the assumed impact of improving the patient experience so that more people are willing to join the study and stay on the study and remain adherent while on the study. The assumptions here are that enrollment is 25% faster than the base case, and that reductions in dropouts and improvements in adherence improve the probability of clinical and regulatory success by 5 percentage points. And I'll share the link to this paper in a moment. They did do a good degree of sensitivity analysis, and in all cases showed that the impact of both cutting the study timeline by speeding enrollment and improving the probability of success is what drives the gain in expected net present value of $30 million. And the final column here is just the sum of the improvements from avoiding one amendment and improving the patient experience. Now, if you were to assume that the sponsor spent about $100,000 in research, staff time, and travel expenses to host a 1 or 2 day facilitated discussion with patients, even the most modest of these scenarios provides a high multiple. Again, this is in oncology. It's a drug-based exploration of the model, and so the economics are very different than they would be in medical devices. But the value drivers of avoiding amendments, improving enrollment, reducing dropouts could apply to numerous product settings. And this, of course, doesn't even address the strategic value to a sponsor of building relationship with the patient community, a reputational boost from setting a precedent in patient engagement, and similar intangibles that are challenging to quantify. With that, I will hand it over to Jen, who will talk about how to go about engaging patients in device development.
Great, thanks, Susan. Great presentation. So I'm going to continue Susan's kind of conversation, if you will, about patient engagement and what that means from a medical device perspective. So I want to first introduce NeuroCheck Network. We're a nonprofit organization, and we focus on education and access to neurotechnologies for people with neurological conditions. And we really want to help the development and access of these devices to the people that they're truly intended to reach. I cannot tell you how many times I get a request from various people in the neurotechnology world of, hey, I'm trying to find people to respond to my survey and I can't get them to respond. And when I ask if they've included the target population in the development of it, they say, no, we just need people to respond. So that worries me. The same thing goes for clinical trials. So many times I get requests to please send out to your networks because we're trying to find people for a specific clinical trial when we've never connected with the end user to make sure that they can help with that type of enrollment. But typically those types of populations, knowing what we know now, are never really going to get engaged in very active into clinical trials until we actually kind of take a step back and have a good conversation and a relationship with them as well. And that reflects in some of the data that Susan showed. And so why does this matter? Why does patient engagement matter with medical devices? Because Susan showed, hey, we've got medical devices that are, or we've got cases from pharmaceutical and cases from oncology. How does this apply to medical devices? Well, it matters to us. And why does it matter to us is because, one thing is the FDA is looking at this. So last fall, the FDA issued some draft guidance on patient engagement. Here is the link to it. Public comment closed, but I'm sure they will be willing to take some input from that. But I think some of the key factors still apply. And here, even though this is a draft, I think these are things that our medical device community needs to take notice of. So for instance, when we look at patient engagement, how they define it is intentional and meaningful interaction with patients that provide opportunities for mutual learning and effective collaborations. And probably the key word in that sentence is collaboration. And so many times in medical devices, I see, well, we do have patients engaged because we're talking with them during a clinical trial. Well, the FDA guidance really helps to help separate that in terms of what the definition is. So they define what a subject or a research participant is, which is an individual that is or will become a participant in research. That means they're a recipient of a test article or even a control. But they clearly state what the difference is in terms of what is a patient advisor. That means that they have some type of experience living with the disease or the condition that you're targeting, and they can serve in an advisory or consultative capacity to improve the clinical investigation design and conduct, but who are not, and that's not my bold, that's their bold, they are not study participants. So they clearly have two different definitions between a participant and an advisor. So one other kind of key thing that CDRH has taken over and has initiated in the recent past is what they call their Patient and Caregiver Connection Program, or their PCC program. This was launched last year. It's still a pilot program, but they have 14 condition-based organizations, including caregivers in that, so that they have a direct line of communication to the end user population or the intended consumers of this. And really, they have a long definition of the purpose of this entire program, but I wanted to highlight that this, as they state, it will enhance their ability to hear, understand, and integrate the perspectives of the end user into the course of their work. So part of that is why we as medical device community needs to be aware of this and actually help develop that relationship with the end user population. And this was actually just taken from their kickoff meeting of their PCC program, is that they really want to have a good understanding of the perspectives so that it can have an impact on the consistency of the regulatory review, on patient engagement, and on optimizing research roadmaps. So they see and they understand the value of patient engagement and what that means. And when they put out these definitions, patient engagement is not just marshaling somebody into the FDA that is living with the condition to take a testimonial. They're looking for both qualitative and quantitative information so that they know that as we're developing devices, that we've really taken account as to the needs and the wants of the end user population. And as they've said, it's really important for them to understand what the risk benefit is. So that's from a regulatory perspective that we see. But what are we seeing from those that are running these types of programs in various types of condition-based? So over the last, I would say about 6 months, we've been doing in-depth interviews with kind of key leaders that are in these types of end user populations. So we've gone out and done interviews with folks from the Friedreich's Ataxia Foundation, those from Creaky Joints or Global Healthy Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar with them, they really focus on arthritis. The Parkinson's Disease Foundation, both the Parkinson's Foundation and the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And then pulling from my own personal experiences, running projects for the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, where we are placing a lot of consumer advisory boards into development of various types of neurotechnology devices. And so what are some of the key findings and key success factors that we found in these types of relationships and that we see across the board of a lot of these different programs in terms of matching people who are doing clinical trials or doing developments in the medical side and matching them with the end user community? Well, one of them is empowerment. That means that the participants are prepared and empowered to participate. So as Susan mentioned, training the end user to really truly understand what that process is and to have some base education so they can be advisors to help the entire process, because it not only helps you, it helps them. There's also a clarity in terms of the collaboration between the two parties. So the expectations are known, what the goals are, what the roles and responsibilities of both sides, both whether it's industry or it's academia and research, or whether it's the end user population. There's also some thoughtful consideration taking into the engagement of the end user. So it's not just putting out a survey and saying, hey, what did we get back? It's involving those end users in the development of the survey and being able to get that back, and also helping to interpret that type of data that comes in, as well as helping to marshal or help in the development process along the way. And some of that key thoughtful consideration is really understanding that language interpretation. Now, I don't mean between Spanish and English or Polish and English or whatever it might be, whatever language. It's really taking it from a technical standpoint and putting it into layman's terms. And finally, the other key success factor we found is communication. And I couldn't say this more, especially I think the folks from the Parkinson's world communicated it best, is that, you know, we might include the end user, but they really want to know what the results are and what the facts are, and to get that type of feedback, because they want to know that the input that they're giving is of value as well. So it's not only a value to one side that's trying to really get an understanding of risk benefit, but it's also to their side to understand, you know, what the rest of their population is saying. Some of the key components in working relationships that we found across the board as well through some of these investigations of different types of programs is that training and recruitment was key, meaning that participants were screened, they were interviewed, we understand their demographics, we understand the level of involvement that they're what they're willing to commit to. So some people can't commit as much time as others who want to be deeply involved. And they keep this active database of participants so that we can call on them and that they can have some touch points with that end user. There's also a valued partnership, again, between industry or the research partners, and a commitment to the program and agreements on both sides. So there's a clear understanding between both collaborators. There's also an outcome value. So again, as I mentioned about communication of results, it's also looking at those thoughtful outcomes that comes out of it. It's not a nice to know, but a need to know to help in the development of devices. And then finally, again, the communication comes up in terms of communicating outcomes, the results, and finding those types of shared experiences between both parties to have a really clear understanding and a really good understanding of the confidentiality of what's being developed. So this is an interesting example. I think one of the questions that we were asked in one of our sessions yesterday is, how do you engage with those with the condition-based organizations? Well, there's a lot of ways, and this is an example taken from a project that was done between CDRH at the FDA and the Michael J. Fox Foundation, where they were really trying to do a stepped approach of engagement with their end users. So they started off as what they call patient scientists, if you will, doing some working groups in a very small group. They only had 8 people in that to really kind of set the tone and set where they were going with their major project. And they upped the ante to about 29, taking a ranking survey to understand what the priorities were as they did that to develop their survey. Then they had some discussion groups and focus groups, if you will, to be able to get some group input of common language. We see that a lot in terms of patient-centric common language. And then they took those surveys back and did some tests with a smaller group of in-depth interviews with their end users. And then from there, through this entire development process, they came out with a larger survey to be able to get some fantastic responses from their community. So this is just one example of stepped approaches, but I think it also shows examples of how different types of patients or end users can be involved in the development process as medical devices or devices are being developed. So really engagement takes a lot of teamwork, and in designing neuromodulation devices with the end user in mind.